Today's Thinking Thursday is going to be about Lady Morgan, who originally was called Sydney Owenson, and she was the daughter of an Irish Catholic and an English Protestant. So her father was Robert Owenson, and he was a comic actor who lived in England, in London, and worked as an actor, but he was actually Irish and he was Irish Catholic. And then while he was in London, he met Jane Hill, who was the daughter of a Shrewsbury trader, and she was a Protestant. And once they got together, they actually moved to Ireland and they lived in Dublin, and they moved in 1776. And then in 1778, they had Sydney, their firstborn. And originally their family was doing quite well, and they had two more daughters, so they also had Olivia and they had Josephine. But unfortunately in 1789, Jane Hill, their mum, passed away. And this is when Sydney was 10 years old, or around 10 years old. But then they were sent off to a private school in Clontarf, and that was the Huguenot Academy. And they did have quite good schooling there. And this was when Sydney really got into reading a lot, and she had quite good teaching. But unfortunately, they then were sent to finishing school in Earl Street in Dublin, and then off to Kilkenny, which is where their father was living at the time. So there was a remoteness, but financial difficulties caught up with them. And so both Olivia and Sydney were sent off to become governesses. So they were working in tutoring and looking after the children of quite fancy people. This is when she found herself as the governess to Featherstones in Brackling Castle, and she kind of became a little bit of a literary queen. So she was an avid reader, but she was also a great conversationalist, and she became a singer and a dancer. So because this family was very well to do and they had a lot of fancy ass people coming to visit them, she became a bit of an entertainer. She took after her father, and she was very much a preference of her father's Irish Catholic side rather than her mother's Protestantism. And this we really see in one of her most famous books, which is called The Wild Irish Girl. Now before that, she'd been inspired by Frances Barney's Camilla and how successful that had been to actually pursue her own career as a novelist. She'd done a little bit of publication of poetry, and she was so well read and so well heard by the encouraging environment of the well-to-do that it gave her the confidence to then also make a collection of Irish tunes that she then wrote lyrics for. So she was already exploring this world and being supported in her creative exhibits in this world, and then she was starting to publish novels. So her first novel was St. Clair in 1804, which was received well, but it wasn't received that widely, and then she published The Novice of St. Dominic in 1806, and this was the same year that she published The Wild Irish Girl. And this was both of those books were received extremely well because she was a very good prose and descriptive writer. However, The Wild Irish Girl is actually an epistolary, which means that it is basically structured like letters between two fictional characters. So she writes in a very interesting way. So it's not only that it's just letters between fictional characters, but it's also that she has a lot of footnotes. She writes these massively extensive footnotes, which are kind of her adding information. And this is where it becomes quite political. So the story is that the Honourable Horatio of M, we never find out what M stands for, he basically banishes his son, the Earl of M, who's also called Horatio, for bad behaviour. He's basically supposed to be at law school. He's like totally skipping out on his studies. He's getting involved in a bit of debauchery and racks up massive debts. So his dad, the Honourable Horatio of M, tells him, you are banished. You have to go off and live out there in Ireland for your bad behaviour. However, Horatio Jr. then disguises himself as a penniless artist and goes to live in a ruined castle. And in this ruined castle are the remnants of Irish nobility. So you have the Prince of Innismore and his daughter, Glorvina. And Glorvina is a very beautiful, very intelligent woman. And then they're also living with Father John, who is a priest. in this dilapidated castle. And this is where Horatio Jr. finds himself falling in love with Glorvina. And the two of them have a bit of an intellectual sparring, because Glorvina is surrounded by these amazing libraries of books and she's very, very intelligent, but she's also teaching Horatio Jr. about Irish culture and Irish nobility. So throughout the book, the prince and Glorvina are giving all these reasons for why nobility and Irish history and the grandness and the graciousness of Irish culture should be respected and valued by the English. And in the book, the battle between the English taking over Ireland and then eviscerating Irish culture, and the Irish trying to stand up for their nobility, their graciousness, and their history, really comes to a head through the footnotes that Sydney Owenson has written, because she actually gives a massive amount of education about Irish history. It's all accurate. All these little footnotes and these editings, even though they're given in quite a narratively neutral voice compared to the interesting prose that's going back and forth between these characters within the letters that are written between Horatio and JD, who's an MP in the book, an English MP. She's giving these very objective notes about the amazing things that are missed by the English when they are trying to eviscerate the Irish culture. So it's a very political book, but it's also political in a second way, which Sydney was kind of more well known for. She writes very strong female characters and she gives them a lot of voice. They are very educated female characters, and she's considered to be proto-feminist because her female characters really stand up for themselves and their own ability to decision make, but also educate. So through The Wild Irish Girl, she's teaching about Irish culture and Irish history, even though it's just written as a character who's kind of scurried away in this corner of the Irish world that's sort of forgotten about. So she's really giving a reason why Irish history and nobility should still be valued, at the same time as bolstering a female character for her beauty and her intellect in her own right, which was something that really didn't happen that much in the books of the time. You have to remember, this is the end of the 1700s. She was writing, well, no, this was in the beginning of the 1800s, so this was in 1806. She's writing at a time where women are only just beginning to get a career in their own right as novelists. It's very rare, and it's very bold to do that. The reason she had the capacity to do this is because she'd been surrounded by the English side of nobility. She'd managed to get a job as a governess, and she managed to expose herself to the well-to-do people of the time. But this was at the crux of the moment where Ireland and England had made a union. There was a battle, there was the Troubles, and not the Troubles that we think of. There was the Troubles of 1668, which had led to a separation between England and Ireland, and it had also led to a lot of Irish nobility having their land stripped from them. Longleat House was actually owned by an Irish family and then stolen by the English. And she actually has a letter that is between her and Sir Malby Crofton of Longleat House, talking about the fact that the Troubles in 1668 caused this separation between the understanding of who owns the titles and who's entitled to the house and the property and the estates. This was from her memoirs, and she did actually manage to write her memoirs right at the end of her life, which are very, very interesting. And I really love the voice that she has in her memoirs. It's so personal and it's so contemporary when you read it. I really enjoy the way that she's written her memoirs. But I also want to talk about her marriage as well, because she didn't end her life as Sydney Owenson. She ended her life as Lady Morgan. So she'd gone from being the daughter of a tradesman's daughter and a financially desolate ex-comic actor to being Lady Morgan and running massively popular soirees in the fanciest parts of Dublin and London. And the reason that she was able to do this is because she married well. She married the philosopher Sir Charles Morgan, who was very successful, but interestingly, he was also very supportive of her writing. So she went on to write loads and loads of novels, but she also wrote about her travels. So she traveled through France and Italy and wrote these travel logs and these travel stories, which were actually considered extremely accurate by the King of Sardinia, the Pope, Lord Byron, and the Emperor of Austria. But the appendices and the finishing was done by her husband. And this is where I see feminism being pulled to the fore, because it's her husband who is helping her to do her work that is extremely well received by nobility. This is the head of the Catholic Church who's saying, totally accurate, that's exactly what Italy's like. So I see practical feminism happening in her household. This is where we start to see how feminism happens. So we often think, oh yeah, feminism was just women getting the vote. No, it has to be the belief in the self first. Before one can even fight for a cause, you have to understand its value. And people like Sydney Owenson, Lady Morgan, were the people who had the opportunity to have the self-worth, the self-value, to create the idea that women deserve the vote in the first place. She was supported by her husband because she'd already been given the opportunity to develop and express her genius. So she also, which I love, super bold, but she also threw massive soirees where she would give readings and she would give these incredibly expensive parties to the likes of people like Sir Thomas More. And she was an inspiration for people like Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley and also Lord Byron. But she also had a bust made of herself by the top sculptor of France, d'Angers. And the bust is currently in the V&A in London, which is where I went to see her image, because she was a tiny woman. This woman had spinal difficulties which caused curvature in her spine, scoliosis, and she was absolutely minuscule. In relation to me, she would have been about this tall. She was absolutely tiny. And I think it's so interesting that a woman who was so small had such big personality, such brilliance, and could be part of the movement to change the freedoms of all women who precede her in both England and Ireland. We can see that the relationship between her father and her mother, the father, the Catholic Irish background, and the mother, the English Protestant, could bring together this union that she would then write about in her books. We're always inspired by our surroundings and the history that preceded us. Women like her who had the confidence and the opportunity to create narratives where empowered women could show off their beauty and their intellect in their own right. She died in 1859, having suffered with bronchial issues while she was traveling around and visiting her fancy friends. But she leaves a legacy behind her of how women can cultivate not only culture through fancy soirees, but also through their own credit of understanding their own excellence, their own humility, and their own history. I hope to do the same, but I think that's too large an ask for me, so instead I will just say I really appreciate women like Sydney Owenson, Lady Morgan preceding me, so I can benefit from the legacy that they leave.